You know what British English towns are like on Friday, Saturday night? You know, no police, they're all in their vans, they're all in the station, they're at home, they're filling in forms, you know. They wear yellow bibs when they're out, but when you want one, you can never see them, can you? You know, and a lot of our older people are, let's face it, frightened to go into town and city centres on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, certainly after 6. And why is this happening? It's partly happening because the concept that Howard's fiction deals with, masculinity, has been completely disprivileged, completely demonised and rerouted in contemporary liberal life. Hostility to masculinity, certainly as defined, say, before 1950, is very considerable and has had a very corrosive effect ideologically, aesthetically. You know, men can have their own pleasures in various zones, which are sort of sneered at and disprivileged. But the centrality of the heroic as a myth for life has largely gone. The way to explicate somebody like Howard, as I did with Lovecraft before, is maybe concentrate on one of their stories. With H.P. Lovecraft, I think I chose The Dunwich Horror. And with Howard, I would choose Rogues in the House, which was published in Weird Tales in the early 30s. One fantasy critic has called it the greatest fantasy story of the 20th century, but that's just one individual's opinion. It's relatively early in the Conan series. Conan is a northern barbarian. And because everything's fused together in Howard, he's got slightly Nordic, Germanic and slightly Celtic traits. He's an outsider, but he has a clean code of masculine barbarism, you see. Civilization is always seen as slightly weak-kneed and sybaritic to Howard. So, and yet at the same time, barbarism has its own inner order. Now, there are counterfactual and countercultural elements there that will be used by social anthropologists in a totally different context, like Levi-Strauss and others, in the middle of the 20th century. But Howard means it in a different way. There's a left-wing street to Howard, in a straight out there was to London, a siding with the outsider, with those ruined by capitalism, by tramps. London's book about the East End is one of the most extraordinary books about mass poverty before George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris in London and How the Poor Die. Well, quite extraordinary works. A poor little hospital in Paris before any sort of socialised medicine, where those who were in the bottom 10%, their corpses were just thrown on the ground, you know, and they died in sort of agony, and then they'd kick you away and put another one on top. You know, this is how the poor die. And Orwell said to this chap in this hospital, but look at the state they're in. And he said, well, you know, they gave up slavery. Here's another batch. You know, this was the attitude then. This is why things like the labour movement, even in the United States in an attenuated way, were created to correct that imbalance as it's seen from the bottom. The far right, of course, always wanted not the class war of the contemporary left, but to socialise mass life in a way that preserved the traditions of the civilization of which we're a part, that brought on what was excellent about the past, and yet realised that the 50% of people who own no capital, the 50% of people who are largely excluded from all centre-right parties' definition of patriotism, are part of the country, are part of the nation, fight the country's wars for the most part when they're asked to do so, and therefore have to be within the remit of social consideration in relation to education, health and other matters. My explanation for Howard's support of the New Deal and that type of politics largely is along those sorts of lines. It's the sort of apolitical chap who likes country and western in a Midwestern state and supports social medicine up to a point as long as it's not too costly, doesn't like Obama, and supports our troops, you see. But it's in a sort of apolitical zone which has got no real knowledge above that. Some of the instincts are right, but the ideological formulation in which that takes place is largely wrong, because even these wars, do you think Iraq was for ordinary white Americans? Do you think Afghanistan has got anything to do with ordinary families living in Nebraska or Nevada or Kansas? None of these wars had anything to do with them at all. Even the black Muslims have worked out that white Gentiles largely are second-class citizens now in the society that they created. But that's another story, and I'd just like to concentrate on Howard. This particular story concerns Conan from the outside. Conan's perceived by an aristocrat and fop called Murillo. Howard's a little bit of a Nordicist. He thinks Southern Europeans are a bit foppish in comparison to Northern Europeans. There's a streak of this. And there's a society, some of the societies seem to be Italy, Corinth, Zamora, but they're not. But they seem to be Italy. Well, there's this Italian city-state that's run by a corrupt priest called Nabonius, who's known as the Red Priest. These myths are set, these stories mythologically encoded, are set before the beginning of recorded history and after the sinking of Atlantis, possibly a fantasy itself. So he sets them far back enough that he can do whatever he wants with them, but at the same time he can import a large amount of retrospective historical insight. The interesting thing is the Machiavellianism of the politics of these stories. All of these societies are run extremely ruthlessly and are run completely for the power interests of the people in charge. The people don't really, the nationalities don't really matter, but they are, if the gloves are off, as marauding and vengeful as their own leaders, who they represent at a lower level. Truly Howard believes with the Roman dictator Sulla that when the weapons are out, the laws fall silent. Now, Murillo is a courtier, relatively corrupt courtier, in this city-state, and Nabonius comes to him one day at a royal council meeting and gives him a small casket that contains a severed ear. And this is a warning, as it would be if a Renaissance prince in post-medieval Italy gave it to a rival, and it's clear off. Get out of the nation-state, as the city-state, as quickly as possible. I'm giving you one day. And Murillo wonders what he's going to do. He can flee, but he's not a coward. Why should he leave his own city? In any case, he's got lots of rackets on the go, so he wants an out, and he thinks, I need to assassinate Nabonius, who runs the drunken priest, who runs the drunken king as a sort of priest-philosopher king, stroke leader of a native death cult within the city, like a puppet master, controls his doll. So he needs a vassal, and he finds it in the prisons of the city, where a young heathen northern barbarian has been captured and led there in chains after various escapades and thefts. And this is a young man of 19 called Conan, who's twice the size of a normal man. All Howard's heroes are all physically enormous, and all incredibly violent, although they all have an honour code of their own, which is very interesting, particularly towards the end of the story. What you might call an innate code of masculine morality and honour, which is part and parcel of natural law. The socially Darwinian view that was spread throughout mass culture, particularly these types of fictions in the late 19th and early 20th century, is not entirely true. As all prisons and all armies testify, there's a code of honour and morality, even in very extreme male behaviour. Rapists are always amongst the most disprivileged in any prison. Men who attack and feed on women, for example, in very all-male and male-concentric cultural spaces are always disprivileged, always disliked. And that's because of innate feelings about how, in a very traditionalist way, what will be called partly a sexist way now, men should treat women. And these things predate all modern ideas and are partly innate. And in some ways, because Howard is such an instinctualist, he brings these sorts of forces to the fore. Now, Nabonius wants Murillo to leave the city. Murillo hires Conan to murder Nabonius. Conan is in his cell sucking some beef off a bone and decides that Nabonius is an upper-class priest, so why not murder him for money? He's an adventurer. So he decides to go with Murillo on this plot. As always with Howard, a synopsis never does justice to the sort of the lucid dreaming of the story itself. Howard always said that he was there and that Conan was next to him like an old soldier dictating his stories, some of which will be tall stories as well. Now, he then hears, Murillo, that Conan has been captured because the guard that he bribed to get him out of the prison has been arrested on another offence. Conan's actually escaped in another way and joins Murillo later. Murillo, desperate, a Borgia without any sort of a family fortune, decides to murder Nabonius himself. So he creeps up to his fortified estate, which is on the edge of town, described in this Gothic way. It's dark, it's sepulchral, it's moonlit. There's an enormous dog that roams the grounds. Remember Conan Doyle's stories? There's always this enormous mastiff that the villain has that roams the grounds to bring people down, and that Watson shoots on Holmes' behalf usually, at the end. And there's remember the Hound of the Baskervilles, which is extraordinarily amusing, because the hound is covered with phosphorus to make it glow in the dark. So when it races after some poor chap who's looking back terrified on the sort of West Country moor, and yet phosphorus is so poisonous